for something to talk about in class. That this is what the class thought, and if you thought X and somebody else thought Y, why is that so? But again, setting up expectations and incentives can both be really important. Okay, what about some in-class strategies? So use some powerful visual images to get them engaged. I already showed you the guinea worm case that I use. Again, for those who are not physically ill, they certainly get the stakes of why you would worry about guinea worm. Using role plays, which can be brief or extended. So we're going to be doing a simulation later I think on Thursday, where the whole class is basically a simulation exercise where you're playing different roles. But they can also be very brief. So remember the Jan Rifkin video where it was I forget, Jenna or Jalissa, why don't you play Pepsi? And that role play went on for about a minute and a half or something like that. But it was a good vehicle for getting people engaged. I already mentioned, I think the most important question you ought to have in your repertoire is the Jan Rifkin question. Does anybody see this very differently? When the discussion starts going off on one track and you want to broaden it out. Don't ask at every class, but it should always be in your pocket if you see the discussion getting too narrow. And you yourself should be prepared to be the devil's advocate. If everybody says X, then you should be prepared to make a case for Y. You can also ask students, say, well, what's the best case that you would make for Y, even though you voted for X? But you can also do that yourself and say, well, I'm Pepsi. I think that they should do this, and engage in a dialogue with students that way. What about students who just don't want to participate? Are there some strategies you can use to bring in non-participating students? So one thing you can do, and again, this is what we do in the LAD program, is we break the students up into small groups so that they have a pre-discussion. But in your classes, what you can do is say, well, let's break up into small groups for 10 minutes and then report back on what your conclusions are in your group. And I'm going to appoint the rapporteur and appoint a student who's quiet, who normally won't talk, to be the rapporteur. They'll feel a little bit more confident because it's not just their own opinions they may not be very confident in, but they can report the consensus of their group. You can also have some alternatives that don't involve speaking in class. So discussion boards, for example, and then sometimes ask for a follow-up. So say, Arena, on the discussion board, you said this, and can you elaborate a little bit more on that particular point of view? Another thing that I have tried sometimes is what's called a warm call for students who don't participate very much, and that is to say, send them an email in advance, say, you're going to be the lead person today, the first person to answer. Here's the question I'm going to ask you. So for people who you don't want to embarrass, who may be sort of reluctant, giving them some advance warning that they're going to be on call can be a way to make it a little less nerve-wracking for them. Okay, it's not going to get rid of it entirely, but at least you're not calling on them cold, and again, provide reminders that this is an important part of your grade, so you need to do this. So let's talk about cold calling. Cold calling means, I go up at the beginning of the class and I say, Vitaly, tell me about Professor Graham and Ms. McComber. What do you think of Professor Graham's style in class? And Vitaly has no idea that this is going to happen. And maybe I will call on Vitaly. I think I will call on Vitaly to start us off on our discussion in a couple of minutes of Professor Graham and Ms. McComber. And of course, you can always say, I pass. But usually, if people know that they may be cold calls, then they're likely to be prepared. So there are advantages and disadvantages to cold calling. I tend not to do it. in my classes. I think it's a good thing to do. I am part of it is my own personality. I am the world's most easily embarrassed person. And so I have great sympathy for people who are easily embarrassed. And so I don't like embarrassing my students, when they're not prepared. But clearly, cold calling that I did, Vitaly knows coming into every class that he may be asked to address this question, increases Vitaly's incentives to come to class prepared. It can also encourage the formation of either formal or informal study groups outside of class so that people, have an opportunity to discuss things. So those are things on the positive side. On the negative side, it does risk embarrassing students, making them resentful, making them withdrawn, and it also, kind of risks getting the class off to a really bad start. So I say, Vitaly, tell me about Professor Graham and Ms. McComber. And Vitaly says, I'm really not prepared, I pass. I then go to Anastasia, and Anastasia says, no, I'm not prepared, I pass. I say, okay, so Yarina, you tell me about it. And Yarina says, well, I pass too, You're getting the class off to a really bad start. So that's another reason that I personally don't do cold calls, because not only would the students be embarrassed, but at that point I'm getting embarrassed as well. And as you already know, I am the world's most easily embarrassed person. Okay, so another option is ask for volunteers, and that's the strategy that I use. I'm not saying it's the best strategy; it's the strategy that I use. Again, the idea of a warm call, tell students beforehand that they may be called on something, is a strategy that they can use. So we're running a little late, so we're not going to have time to talk now about what works best at your institution and for your students. But hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss it in the later session we do. So last piece of advice here is never humiliate a student, even if they deserve it. And there are times when you at least, maybe they don't really deserve it, but you will feel that they deserve it. Don't do it, okay? It will come back to haunt you, many times over. The students will say, this professor is a jerk, okay? And okay, that will be reflected in your course evaluations, but even if you don't care about your course evaluations, you want them to be engaged, you want them to have a good feeling generally about this class. And if you humiliate a student, then you're going to lose that good social capital. Okay, closing a class. We're almost at the end here. So what are some different ways that you can close a class? You can summarize some things that you think are key takeaway points, either orally or in writing, and potentially in handout form. We'll talk more about handouts in a second. You can ask one or two students at the beginning of class to provide takeaways. So you can say, okay, today Vitaly and Anastasia are going to provide our takeaway points. So, right at the beginning of class. So Vitaly and Anastasia say, okay, I really have to be awake in this class, I really have to pay attention. But you are ceding some level of control there. If you have great confidence in Anastasia and Vitaly, then okay, but if you don't, it could be a problem. You can ask for volunteers. Say, so what do you take away from this class? What do you learn from this class? And ask volunteers. I never do that. And the reason I never do that is because, it's right at the end of class. It's a couple minutes before the end of class, and people are tired and they're already thinking about lunch or something else. And so you get silence, and remember, I am the world's most easily embarrassed person. And so after like 15 seconds of silence, which actually tends to be self-reinforcing, then you start thinking, oh wow, they didn't learn anything in class today. So, it's one strategy you can use. It's not a strategy that I used. Certainly you can take more control in terms of relating the case either to something that's come before, something that's in the local news. And again, in terms of time management, always try to finish by the end of class, okay? Try not to go over, especially if you have takeaway points that you really want to make when the clock hits the minute hand where they're getting out of there, they're totally switched off. They're not going to be paying attention. They're thinking about where am I going next. So always try to do your takeaways before the actual end of class. Your takeaways, should, I would argue, not be, this is what you should have learned from this class. And this is the only thing that's important. I always view it as, here are some concluding points, not the only concluding points, but here are some things that I think are important, not the pure wisdom. Because then the students are likely to think, well, why didn't you just tell me that in the 4 minutes, and then we wouldn't have wasted all this time going through all this discussion. So they shouldn't be too numerous, or they'll be forgotten by the time the students hit the door. You should try to link them to your overall semester plan in terms of showing some progression of this builds on what we did before. So again, it's not just we did another case, there's another case, we did a case last week, and they should clearly be related to each other. They should extend rather than summarizing some of the points you sought to bring out in class. And I think it's always worthwhile to link to things that the students said in class. So say that, as Vitali said about Professor Graham's strategy, it validates things that the students have said, sort of gives them some positive feedback, makes them feel better, and it kind of lessens the perception that the professor is the giver of wisdom. It's that everybody's contributing to what we're learning in this class. Okay, so another question is, should you give written handouts of takeaway points? And again, there are disadvantages and advantages, and I'll tell you that I do it, not in every class, but in a lot of my class sessions, I have written a takeaway. So let's start off with the risks. What are the downsides? The risks are, they may lower student incentives to listen in class. It's like, okay, he's going to give me the takeaways at the end of class, so I don't really need to pay attention because the essential points are going to be done. And again, they reinforce this notion that the professor is the giver of all wisdom. So I recognize those risks. Those are clear risks. So why do I do it? And again, in my classes, with my students in the master's program, I don't do it in lab programs because you guys are more mature, more senior, you're faculty members in this case, but when I'm talking about my master's level students. So why do I do it there? Well, if I have like 5 takeaway points and I'm trying to get through them fairly quickly because I can see the clock ticking away, students are rapidly scribbling and they're not going to get it right, and they're going to miss some of the points, and they find that frustrating. Attention is declining at the end of class. So what I'll do is I may have 5 takeaway points, and I'll say, I hand them out and I say, I'm going to highlight 1, 2, and 3 here, but I think all of these are important. They give you leeway in terms of, remember, time management. We often run short. I'll end up, just finishing the case at the end of class and say, don't have time to go over the takeaways, but here are some concluding thoughts that you can take with you and look over at your leisure. But I think the most important thing, again, for students in my teaching at Georgetown I have so many students who do not have English as a first language that if I want to make sure that they got it, having it in writing, something they can take away, is something that they find really helpful. Okay, so some other final teaching hints. So one has to do with placing yourself in the classroom. I like to move around a lot in the classroom. I'm not doing it very much in this session, in part because the camera is fixed. And hi, camera. When I come over here, to talk to Yarina, the camera can't see me, but normally I move around a lot in the classroom. And in part, that's because I can then check to make sure that in fact people aren't looking at their phones and checking Facebook on their phones. But it also allows me to focus on particular students. And so if Anastasia has a very soft voice, I'm probably going to move over to sort of the center of where I want her to be projecting her voice. And I am also saying by moving away and also making a visible symbol, raise your voice, that she should speak louder so that everyone should hear. And if I've got a nice debate going between Anastasia and Yarina, then I am likely to kind of stand off to the side so that the focus becomes on the two of them and not on me. Okay. After class. So some suggestions after class. If you're grading on participation, what's the half-life of your memory about how people participated in class? Half an hour later, you're going to remember nothing. So if you're really grading on participation, then jot down some quick notes. It can just be a check. Check plus for people who did extra things, right after class. Also jot down some notes about what worked and what didn't work in class, because you're going to say, oh, I really need to change this when I teach this next fall, 9 months from now. But 9 months from now, you're not going to remember what actually worked in the class. So do it now. And again, go over your teaching plan, especially your time management plan and your teaching note if you wrote the teaching note immediately. And finally, you should always have sort of a secret time management plan and a whiteboard plan, whiteboard management plan here. You should rarely have a single right answer. Most cases don't have single right answers. And you should always try to draw parallels, connections from previous questions, previous cases, and praise students when they make those kinds of connections. Okay.